This lecture video is about Peter Singer's essay, All Animals Are Equal. Singer is a famous utilitarian, and in this case, he's actually going to argue why animals deserve the same kind of equal treatment that we give to human beings, that we should extend this beyond just human beings to all species who are capable of suffering. So his argument works like this. The first premise is that beings have interests if they're capable of suffering. Second premise, human beings and many non-human animals are capable of suffering. Therefore, human beings and many non-human animals have interests. To say, of course, a being has an interest is to say they should be taken into account. They should be given the same kind of weight. Now, the fourth premise then, so we grant that human beings and many non-human animals have interests, namely the interests of not suffering. The fourth premise advocates the basic principle of equality. This says that the interests of every being are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the interest of any other being. So premise 5 then, human beings and many non-human animals have an interest in avoiding suffering. Therefore, the interest non-human animals have in avoiding suffering is to be given the same weight as the interests human beings have in avoiding suffering. Singer begins by looking at the history, the way, the tactics that liberation movements work. They work by seeking to expand our moral horizons. That if there's a prevalence of racism, the idea is, well, to overcome racism, you have to expand the idea of race, of one being privileged over the other. You show how actually among all the different races, the interests are the same. And this is why it is not morally permissible to grant more weight to one race over another. The same thing in the case of sex, whether it be between male or female, historically, right? In the case of feminism, seeking to show that women have the same interests of men and therefore should be given equal consideration. Or in the case of orientation, right? Gay rights, trans rights, and so on, in the same case as straight individuals. So typically, the practices we engage in, specifically when they are kinds of maybe morally impermissible, ultimately by what liberation movements are going to claim, they work because they're regarded as natural, right? So that if you grow up in a kind of, let's say, the Jim Crow South or something like that, the dominant, practice is that, well, I can be racist as let's say, a white, wealthy man, because there's this kind of assumed natural inferiority. And so liberation movements, what they do is, by expanding moral horizons, they want to make it such that everyone can come to see such practices as not natural, but based on unjustifiable prejudice. So what Singer wants to do then is use that same kind of a mental switch in liberation movements of expanding the moral horizons, showing that the same thing should take place towards non-human animals, that we should extend to other species the same principle of equality that we recognize should be extended to members of our own species. Now, one example of this liberatory moral horizon being expanded is in Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. So this was published in the late 18th century, where what she does is she tries to show that you have liberalism, which is advocating for this idea of natural rights, most famously in the case of life, liberty, coming from the French Revolution, life, liberty, and solidarity, and that these same rights apply to women as well, all human beings. Specifically, in the case of the Vindication of the Rights of Women, she tries to show how, in that way, the kind of education that girls should be given should be equal to that of boys, such that they can be given the same, let's say, necessary understanding that allows them to succeed, to pursue rational ends as a human being. Now, when Wollstonecraft published this, you had someone known as Thomas Taylor who responded with an anonymous satire where he tried to argue that the idea of equality between the sexes is a kind of slippery slope, that if we took it seriously, that men and women should be treated the same, well, then where do we stop? Why shouldn't animals be given the same treatment as human beings as well? This has been a famous way to dismiss liberatory movements, where wherever the space, of course, of liberation is interested. So, let's say in the early 2000s, right up before the Supreme Court in the United States legalized same-sex marriage, the idea was, well, what's going to happen now if you have gay people that are allowed to marry? Then you're going to have to say that human beings are going to be allowed to marry animals and so on, right? So the slippery slope is historically used to try to stop moral progress. In this case, interestingly enough, with respect to suffering, right, what Singer wants to do is confront head-on that idea of the slippery slope. Confront head-on the idea that, brutes having the same rights of other human beings with respect to, being interested in not suffering, showing that that is actually morally correct. Now, the question in trying to expand our moral horizons with respect to non-human animals is identifying what kind of quality it is that matters. Now, in the case of, feminism historically, it was claimed that, well, men and women have different kinds of biologies, or they have different physiologies, and so we can see this kind of a difference, that if we're talking about equality, typically it's, admitted that, well, if you have these different biologies and physiologies, then it's not your biology, it's not your physiology that determines why certain individuals should be given certain rights and others shouldn't be given certain rights. So typically in response to this idea that the sexes can have different biologies, it would be claimed, well, both men and women possess reason, and because they possess reason, therefore, all beings that possess reason should be given the same kind of rights. Natural rights apply to all of them. Their interests should all be taken into account equally. This is typically known as the argument from rationality, that what is privileged in this case, then, is whether you possess reason or not. There are, of course, issues with the argument from rationality. If you think of care ethics, for example, and this idea that, well, if we're going to say, well, whether you possess reason or not determines whether you should be given equality or not, well, what if someone's born with a severe cognitive disability? We say that they're a human being, but yet it seems like they don't possess reason like others do, so therefore would we say we don't have to take into account their suffering, or whether or not they have certain interests? And of course we say no, right? You can't just treat someone with a severe cognitive disability in whatever manner you want to treat them. So there are limits with respect to appeal to reason, appeal to rationality as a quality that determines the kind of equal consideration we're interested in. So, in response to this, Singer says the quality that matters is interests. So, for example, a pig is not capable of voting. Because the pig's not capable of voting, can't engage in it, a pig doesn't have the same kind of interest in voting that other human beings do. So if one can vote, one has an interest. All people that can vote should be given equal consideration with respect to voting. Therefore, likewise, any being that can suffer should be given the same kind of equal treatment with respect to suffering. Now, this doesn't mean, Singer says, that what we're interested in is the kind of equality of outcome, that we want to ensure there's this kind of same level of happiness or something else that everyone is given. But instead what matters is equality of consideration. So equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatments, and it may lead then to different rights. But the point is, if any being has an interest in any one area, and we want to apply this consistently, then depending on the kind of interest, if any being has that interest, they should be given equality. So what he's advocating for is normative equality. He says the principle of equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat humans. Singer brings up this example of historically, let's take the case of racism. Right? It's not the case that advocates of liberation movements that seek to overcome racism say, well, the whole reason why we're against racism is because really we're all naturally the same, descriptively or empirically or scientifically, biologically, whatever, right? It's not that you rest your desire for equality on whatever the evidence turns out to be, such that, well, if it turns out the science later on shows there are differences among the races, then, well, because that's just how it is as a kind of natural fact, that therefore we shouldn't have equality among the races anymore. Singer says that's ridiculous, right? That's not the kind of equality that liberation movements are interested in. They're interested in normative equality, regardless of the kind of actual equality among whatever qualities they may be biologically or whatever else. That's not what matters. What matters is the way that we engage with each other. That's important because the claim Singer's making here is a moral claim of equality. Because, of course, human beings and animals are different in all kinds of ways. So when we take into account the equal consideration of interests, we find that non-human animals have the equal interest in not suffering. Then, according to, or along these lines of suffering, all animals are equal. So it would be immoral to, eat another non-human animal. It would be immoral to, lock them up for, however much time if they end up suffering because of it. Now, that's not the case that you can't, maybe lock them up in a cage because you're going to transport them somewhere else, to a vet or something like that, right? That's in their own interest, ultimately. But you don't do so without concern in the same way that you wouldn't just, leave a child locked up for, a day or two, right? And forget about their well-being. So in all capacities that we can, we should prevent as much as possible suffering to non-human animals the same way that we think about other human beings. Now, Singer considers this objection, why not then treat other things that exist equally as well? So other things that aren't even animals, why not treat those things equally? In response, Singer says, the capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interests in any meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interests of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. A stone does not have interests because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we can do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. A mouse, on the other hand, does have an interest in not being tormented because it will suffer if it is. So why couldn't we say then that, this glass in front of me, I shouldn't just use it as a means to an end, which is here in this case hydrating? That I seem to be taking advantage of this glass, right? Or I shouldn't, hit it, right? In the same way that I wouldn't, just hit another human being. But Singer's point is this doesn't affect its well-being if we think about well-being as to the extent that one suffers or is happy or experiences pleasure. This can't experience pleasure. It can't suffer. So it has no interest in me not doing things to it that might cause it to suffer because it can't suffer. But a mouse and other non-human animals can suffer, so they do have interests in how I treat them. So if a being can suffer, then there is not any kind of moral justification for not taking that into consideration. Singer calls this speciesism, in the same way that we think of racism as not taking into account the kinds of experiences of other races, in the same way that we might think of sexism as not taking into account the equality of the sexes and so on. The same thing in this case, as we talk about racism, applies to other species, the way that we treat them any way we want. So just as racism then violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of one race, Singer says likewise, speciesism violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of one's own species. He identifies three great areas of speciesism. The first is eating, the way that we eat meat, that we can cause suffering then to non-human animals, especially most prevalently in factory farming. The kinds of conditions that animals experience in factory farming is just objectively an unpleasurable experience, to put it lightly. So eating is engaging in speciesism, the eating of non-human animals. So it's immoral then to eat anything that can suffer. The second area is experimentation. So we might think of like testing new drugs on rats or monkeys or something like that, right? Seeing, well, does this medication work? If it ends up working on the trials in rats, let's say, then it can work in the case of human beings. Well, Singer's going to say that's not taking into account that specific animal's suffering. So therefore, this would be in the same way if we said, well, there's a certain race, we want to test out our drugs to see if it works on one race. If it does, then we'll, see if it works for all of human beings. We would regard that as being racist. In the same way, Singer says this is speciesist. The third area Singer identifies as philosophy. He thinks philosophy, going back to Socrates, has this tradition of seeking to be a liberatory enterprise, seeking to expand our epistemological or moral horizons. Yet philosophy has failed to take into account the interests of non-human species. So for philosophy to return to its roots as a liberatory project, it must embrace the idea of speciesism. So there are a few objections we can briefly consider. So what about someone in a persistent vegetative state who does not, isn't capable of experiencing suffering? Does this mean that the charge of speciesism couldn't apply to them, that we can kind of do with them what we like as long as they can't suffer? It seems intuitive that we would say, well, you can't just kind of do whatever you want with them just because they can't suffer, that they're still a human being. So how do we reconcile this with Singer's idea about speciesism? Secondly, if we're interested in the suffering of all non-human animals, why not advocate the practices of something like Jainism, where we wear masks over our face all the time, we sweep in front when we walk so we don't breathe in any kind of sentient creature that might possibly be capable of suffering? So this is more of an objection not against Singer's argument, but actually saying, well, maybe Singer doesn't go far enough. And finally, does Singer's idea of speciesism obscure systemic critique? Because what it does is it says you are immoral, that you ought not to engage in, for example, eating meat. But does this obscure the fact that there's a whole system that's behind the practice of eating meat? There's a whole kind of consumer culture. There's a whole kind of culture industry, to use the critical theorist term, that kind of makes it such that it's ingrained into our daily practices, and it actually is very difficult to get a healthy, nutritious diet without eating meat. That perhaps then this doesn't take into account class, that lower classes are often the kinds of places that they live in are maybe what are called food deserts, or they're options for what they can eat. Maybe they don't have enough of non meat options to satisfy their diets in terms of getting the kinds of nutritions they want, and that really then this is a problem of a system. It's a systemic issue that we have to change then the kind of incentives for the structure of our food and how we engage in that, and attack then the capital interests that are behind the meat industry. So these are just a few objections to think about with Peter Singer's All Animals Are Equal essay.